Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Halper from ICAHD with my August 2025 monthly update. Uh, like I always do, as you know, I place everything within a settler colonial analysis. Settler colonialism for me is not simply an accusation or a mantra, it really means something. And unless we understand the process of settler colonialism, the structures, the logic, the intent, um, then we really don't understand what Israel is doing, why Israel is doing what it's doing, what's happening to the Palestinians, and where this is all going. And there are four stages, really quickly, of settler colonialism. The first stage is invasion and settlement, because it's an invasion. Settler colonialism is unilateral. There is no conflict. There is no Israel-Palestine conflict because Palestinians never had a conflict with Jews. They never had a conflict at any point in history. What began this whole thing was the Zionist unilateral invasion of Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century. It was an invasion. It was violent. In the early years, there was already an Israeli militia, the foundation of an Israeli army. And then after World War I, when Britain took over, and really Britain took over with a mandate, both of its own government and the League of Nations, to prepare uh, for Palestine to become the national home of the Jewish people. This is the language of the mandate. So Britain had a mandate to advance the idea of an Israeli state, a Jewish national home, to be a partner in the settler colonial project. And that began after World War I, the process of Judaization, the process of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish one, transforming Palestine into Israel today. Displacement of obviously taking the land. Uh, Genocide is built into settler colonialism. So you either, or you don't either. You actually, it's a mix of things. You kill as many as you can. And we see this happening in Gaza, as many of the indigenous population. You expel as many of the indigenous as you can. Today, half the Palestinian people live as refugees outside, although some are inside camps in Palestine. And then you marginalize whatever remains in what has to be called an apartheid, what South Africa used to call a Bantustan. This is the only way out for a settler colonial project. If you can't eliminate all the indigenous, you have to then create little islands in which you can find them. I mean, the United States has reservations, for example. Um, and that's and then the fourth stage, no, that's a Judaization process, which is going on until today, obviously. Now, the third stage that we're in now, which is really important, is the stage of pacification. Resistance is built into settler colonialism. You know, an indigenous population, a native population, the Palestinians in our case, simply don't passively step aside and allow the settlers to take over their country. They resist. Now, resistance is always criminalized. Um, it becomes terrorism, right? And it becomes illegitimate in the eyes of the states and so on. But we have to see it in the context of settler colonialism as resistance. So, in order for the final stage to take place, which is normalization, it's not a defeat of the indigenous. It's nothing dramatic. It's a gray, dry process of simply normalizing the facts on the ground that the settlers have created, um, since their invasion. So that where we are now is in phase three, just at the cups of the final phase four. In other words, you have to explain Gaza not as simply a reaction to October 7th. You know, a conflict, this isn't a conflict. And it's not just a series of events. One day a war breaks out, the next day there's negotiations, the next day there's an attack. No, there's a pattern and a process and a logic to it. And the logic is pacification at this stage. Israel has to break the last vestiges of Palestinian resistance in order to create an industrial quiet that will then allow the Arab governments, especially Saudi Arabia, to come into the Abraham Accords and then to achieve this normalization in which Israeli settler colonialism wins. Palestine is Judaized, it becomes Israel, and the Palestinians that remain are locked into a little Bantustan that, according to the two-state solution, will be called a Palestinian state. And then it's over, basically, because normalization is a kind of a closure. It's not in negotiations. You don't go back. Whatever you've succeeded in putting on the ground, if you're the settler colonial power, that's the basis on which normalization takes place. And that's why you have in Gaza the pacification and you know, in Israel's attempts, in Israel's plans, the idea of actually expelling 2 or 2.5 million Palestinians to Libya, the Sudan, Indonesia, wherever. That's a part of that same process of eliminating the native population. And in the West Bank, pacification, which is taking place in the north of the West Bank and the camps with Israeli military operations, but also the unleashing of these violent settlers to drive Palestinians in rural areas off their lands in order that those lands be taken over completely. And that's what we see today. So the fact that you know, it's really interesting that as much as Gaza is in our minds and thoughts, and the whole world is speaking about Gaza, and you know, the humanitarian crisis and the genocide, even that word is being used, and so on. From Israel's point of view and that of the United States, it's really become a non-issue. It isn't that important. Because again, the purpose of what Israel is doing in Gaza is pacification. And that's the only goal that Israel really cares about. And the fact is that the United States is letting Israel do that. You know, Witkoff came this last week, even went to the West Bank to check out the humanitarian. The agenda was not a return to negotiations with Hamas. The agenda was not freeing the hostages. I mean, the hostages are dying. We've gotten just terrible films of the hostages over the last few days. No, the agenda was cosmetic, optics. How do we make the humanitarian effort effective enough that you don't get these films of starving children in Gaza and so on? But the point is that the purpose of what Israel is doing in Gaza is intact. Pacification, destroying Hamas as a resistance organization, and if possible, again, expelling hundreds of thousands, if not a couple million people. So that remains. So that remains that essential prerequisite towards normalization remains in Gaza. So everything we're concerned about is irrelevant within the framework of the settler colonial process that the United States is letting happen. And in the West Bank, of course, you've got the ethnic cleansing. We had the terrible shooting this last week of my friend, you know, Awdah Hathaleen in Al-Khair, you know, by a violent settler who everyone knows, who was even sanctioned by the Biden government, Yinon Levi, whose sanctions were rescinded the first day of the Trump administration, who shot Awdah 3 times in the chest when he was standing 35 meters away. This violent settler had come to expand the settlement that exists, Carmel settlement, further into the lands of Al-Khair, and was met by resistance and shot Awdah at that time. Now, Awdah's body has not been returned. The Israeli army has a condition. They'll only return his body if there are less than 15 people at any kind of a mourning ceremony, and that he not be buried in Al-Khair itself. He be buried somewhere else, so he does not become a shaheed, a martyr, and so on. The women of the village protested. 70 women went on a hunger strike. More than 17 people in Al-Khair, Awdah's family and others have been arrested. Many of them are still in jail in the Ofer prison in the West Bank. And so, the saga continues. And in the meantime, in the first couple days, the violent settler Levi was put under house arrest, but then released. Today, he's a free man. And there were reports yesterday of seeing him back in Al-Khair with the bulldozer again, with the plans, continuing the plans of expanding the fence, expanding the territory of the settlement into Al-Khair, the same thing, almost uninterrupted by his killing of Awdah, over the past week. So it really shows the degree to which the army, the government, and the settlers work hand in hand in order to Judaize, to continue to Judaize the West Bank. And again, why is this so urgent? Because we're heading into the process of normalization. Trump is pushing the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia wants to join, maybe even Syria and Lebanon would join in. And so everything is moving towards this normalization. So normalization should be really at the top of our minds when we think about all this, because this is where, again, Israel's going to win, basically. Settler colonialism has an end. It doesn't go on. It doesn't go on forever. Uh, and I guess then that brings up the question, so what do we do about it? All right, we're protesting Gaza. We're doing everything we can possibly to relieve the suffering in Gaza, to get to a ceasefire and so on. Less attention, of course, is being paid to the West Bank. The settler project continues apace in the West Bank. So what do we do? And I think that's really the problem that we're facing, is that we don't have what I would call an international coordinating committee on Palestine. We have no center. There's wonderful organizations working all over the world, hundreds of organizations doing really good work, but there's very little coordination. I think our situation today is something like the thousand flowers that are blooming, that the Chinese saying. There's a thousand flowers blooming. Well, those flowers are all your organizations that exist. From the big national organizations you have to regional to local, religious and political and human rights and BDS and so on. They all do wonderful things. Those are the thousand flowers that are blooming. But flowers don't exist in the air. What are they grounded in? Flowers have to be in the ground. There has to be a ground from which the rooting. In some ways, it doesn't give them purpose, but it's what allows them to emerge. It's their point. And the ground is Palestine. The ground is the Palestinian struggle. We can't separate the flowers from the struggle, and there is a disconnect today. The organizations abroad are doing their work, sometimes wonderful work, but they're setting the agendas. They're planning the campaigns, and there is very, very little coordination with Palestinians here in Palestine. There are some very well-known figures that do great work, that are invited as speakers often to conferences or to events abroad, but there is really very little contiguous political planning, coordination, and activity with Palestinians here, which is a real problem. So there's a disconnect between the flowers and the ground. But something else there's another missing element here. How do the flowers get to be 1,000? How do they spread? How do they become effective in a way as a part of nature? Well, those are the bees. So I think what's missing here are the bees. The organizations exist, the Palestinian ground exists, but the bees, the ones that are coordinating, connecting, pollinating, making this fruitful, bringing this all forward towards a just resolution and not normalization of an apartheid regime, that's really what's missing. I'm throwing this out because all I can do is throw it out. There is no address, and that's, I think, our problem. So I think we should begin to think collectively about setting up some kind of a coordinating organization, an international coordinating committee on Palestine that would really begin to make our work more effective because, again, we know the process of settler colonialism. We know where Israel is going. We know what it's doing in Gaza and why. We know what's happening in the West Bank and why. Simply opposing all of these things as separate little elements, um, focusing on one thing or another without seeing the system as a whole, opposing the system and the process of normalization as a whole is ineffective. We have to have a much more thought out and organized kind of a Palestinian, critical Israeli, international movement. If we're going to really be able to fight what's coming up right now, normalization. So the most urgent thing that we should be doing now, in my view, is launching a campaign against normalizing Israeli apartheid. Because the Abraham Accords are on our doorstep. They're just a couple months away, maybe. So that we're really reaching the end of the settler colonial process, and we have to be mobilized against normalization. It's not the sexiest thing to normalize against. Again, it's a dry, gray kind of a process, which is really the point of it, but we have to do that. And we have to fight this idea of the two-state solution. It was just a big conference in the United Nations this week that came out with what's called the New York Declaration about the importance of a two-state solution. But if you look at the document that has something like 42 different items to it, the only thing that really refers to a Palestinian state is item 19, in which all these countries of the United Nations, and it's going towards, this is a preparatory document that is supposed to be approved by the General Assembly in September. It says, item 19 on this whole issue of a two-state solution says we affirm our unwavering support for the implementation of the two-state solution in which two sovereign democratic states, Palestine and Israel, live side by side in peace and security within recognized and secure borders based on the 1967 lines, including with respect to Jerusalem. That's it. In other words, there's nothing about, wait, what does sovereignty really mean? What are the borders? What do you mean based on? An apartheid state could be based on the 67 lines. The 67 lines are completely open and undefined. What about economic viability? What about control of borders? What about this issue of that it has to be, and that's in the statement, the Palestinian state has to be demilitarized. Why? Why should it be put in a position of not being able to defend itself? Why can Israel be super militarized? You see, in other words, not only is the two-state solution completely impossible today, with 800,000 settlers in the West Bank and no political will on the part of the international community to actually force Israel into a two-state solution, it's basically unjust, and it does not decolonize the settler colonial process. Unless it's decolonized, you can get every kind of arrangement you want, 2 states, 3 states, 5, whatever you want, confederations, federations, cantons, whatever you want. Unless you decolonize, Israel continues to control the country. It continues to be Judaized, and the Palestinian state simply remains a Bantustan. So I think we have to expose this two-state fraud that our own governments, the United Nations, are pushing. And at the same time, we have to highlight the normalization process within the framework and pacification that's happening in Gaza and the West Bank within the framework of settler colonialism. And then we, the Palestinians and their supporters, we have to organize better in order to put forward, first of all, our own vision, which I suggest would be one democratic state of equal rights for everyone in historic Palestine, That allows also the return of the refugees. That has to be fleshed out again. Um, and then we have to have some kind of central coordinating body for all the work we're doing. An international coordinating committee on Palestine is what I call it, just to give it a name, but something like that. So that's the update politically, but more so the update in terms of where we are in terms of the settler colonial process. The analysis is really important because there is a timeline. And if we're not sensitive to the process and where we're going and the significance of the Abraham Accords, all our protests, we're missing the train, basically. We're protesting, but we're not really stopping the process of Judaization, of colonization, and in the end of decolonization and getting to a just resolution, which in my view is, again, one democratic state. We'll leave it at that for this month. See you soon. Bye.